Alright guys, so the economic war is taking an interesting twist. We know the US isn't going back on their sanctions. Whether it's targeting Chinese tech or Russian commodities, it's escalation after escalation. But now we are seeing targeted countries strike back. A week ago, Biden tightened the screws on Gazprombank. This is the same bank EU countries had to deal with to buy their supply of cheap Russian gas. They would pay Gazprombank with rubles directly, and the Russians would send the gas to the buyers. US sanctions cut this link off and threatened Europe's energy supply. Well, now Putin he has flipped the script on the US. Russia has officially lifted the requirement to pay for gas through Gazprombank, and this was after countries like Hungary warned against incredibly high energy prices. Because of the geopolitical situation, EU gas prices they have more than doubled within the last 9 months and is basically pushing their economies to the breaking point. There's no way to compete with the US or Chinese manufacturing. Everything from your cars to chemicals is now highly uncompetitive. Even if you tariff China, you still lose global market share. But let's talk more about Putin's new decree. It's a brilliant move that sets up a complex web of alternative payment routes that will confound the US. Gazprombank would still be the final destination for ruble payments. However, foreign buyers can use other financial institutions to convert money into rubles before the transfer. And this is a very important distinction. If you are hungry, you could bypass transacting directly with Gazprombank, which is under US sanctions. The currency exchange could happen in another institution that would then transfer the payment to Gazprombank. It's another example of how US sanctions tend to backfire. Now, Russia has two clear options to continue supplying Europe with gas. They could create new entities and play whack a mole with the United States, create new banks for EU companies to convert euros to rubles before transferring the money to Gazprombank. But another option could be to involve Chinese banks, get the EU to transit the payments through China. And if the US sanctions China, well, we could have a pretty nasty economic war on our hands. Regardless of the option, Europe doesn't have much of a choice now. There's no way to cut off their remaining supply of cheap energy, and we can see this desperation from Turkey. They are seeking a US sanctions waiver to continue their purchase of Russian gas. Turkey's purchases are for Europe. Now, Istanbul is only a transit point for their final destination of the Russian supply, and it's pretty obvious that the EU is behind this push for exemption. And as Putin issued his decree, the price of gas is starting to fall by over 2%. And this confirms how important Russian gas still is to Europe. Despite what von der Leyen wants, the Russian gas and LNG still makes up 15% of total supply to the EU. This is direct gas imports Europe is paying Moscow directly. We aren't even counting re-exported LNG coming from countries like China or certain supplies through third parties as well. So the percentage is probably closer to 20%, maybe even 25%. But the situation is going to get worse for Europe. While some gas supply goes through Turkey, a ton of gas still flows through Ukraine, and talks are beginning to shut off this vital supply. Now, once this happens, the EU will be forced to buy more expensive alternatives. This, of course, means LNG from the US and the Middle East. Europe is about to get clobbered once again. According to Gazprom's 2025 plan, they have already assumed the worst, that there would be no more gas transiting through Ukraine into Europe. And if this happens, many countries, including Austria, would be affected. This deal generates around $1 billion in transit fees for Ukraine, so it does generate revenue for Kiev. Gazprom wants it to continue, but the base case for Russia is for the deal to be torn apart. And if this happens, a huge supply line, the Sudza, will become inactive. Direct gas supply to Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia will be cut off, and this makes the energy crisis even worse. This move is even worse than the Gazprombank sanctions. If the gas can't flow through Ukraine, there's no need for any talk of payments. It's a physical block, and Europe would most definitely suffer. Since 2022, around 5% of EU's gas imports comes from the Ukraine transit. It's over 110 terawatt hours worth of energy in the first 8 months alone. It looks like a drop in the ocean, but this is likely the cheapest pipeline gas Europe has access to. And if this stops, There would be only two other routes for Russian gas to flow to. One would be through the Turk Stream pipeline, and that would cut across Turkey into Serbia or Hungary. But the more likely option is for the gas to end up in China. And knowing the Chinese, their industries need a ton of cheap energy to stay competitive. So Beijing would be happy to buy up any excess supply at a discount. This is the big danger facing Europe in the months to come. The spike in gas prices probably isn't over just yet. A new energy shock is coming. And considering the situation EU countries are in, a supply disruption now would be horrible. Which brings us to the topic of France. Macron's government is on the verge of collapse, and Le Pen, well, she looks to be gathering momentum. The grand project of Macron is in ruins, his prime minister is gone, and it only took a few months at that. And now Le Pen is one step closer to a victory. Much has been said about the political chaos in France, so I don't really want to repeat it. Macron calling for the snap elections was a disaster, and he left France without clear political leadership. But we must talk about the French economy because it's the second biggest in the EU. And if France falls, this will cause absolute chaos in Brussels. They might even need to prepare a bailout. We just need to look at the spreads of French to German bonds. It's an indicator of how risky investors view buying French debt. The higher this number goes, the more dire the economic situation is. Since June this year, French yields have been flying up relative to Germany, from under 50 basis points to nearly 90. This is bad for a country that's addicted to spending. Even a plan to raise 60 billion euros in taxes and spending cuts didn't boost confidence. No one believes France can stop spending money. A year ago, Macron enacted the pension reform. The retirement age went from 62 to 64, which was highly unpopular. So trying to impose even more austerity on the French people is unthinkable. And this is at the core of the government collapse. Barnier wanted to drop the deficit fast, but Le Pen wants a slow drop in the deficit, which also is another problem. Investors just don't trust France to keep the deficits in order, and paradoxically, the higher bond yields go, the worse it would get for the interest payments, and that pushes the deficit up even further. France has consistently missed their deficit targets. The EU limit is around 3%. Just this year alone, France borrowed and spent over 6% of GDP. That's just as bad as the United States. The first order of business for France is to settle French politics. It's a big mess, and with Macron refusing to resign, it's going to get worse. Business sentiment is starting to collapse, and Le Pen's plan to gradually reduce the deficit doesn't solve the core problem. France, like Germany, is starting to lose their industries, their competitiveness. They are living well beyond their means, and the only solution is to grow the economy faster than the deficit. But can that really happen? Firstly, we need to address the coming trade war with the US. We know Trump wants to slap every country with a 10% tariff, and this includes the EU as well. So French exports are at serious risk. Excluding the EU, 16% of French exports go directly to the United States. That's around 44 billion euros worth of goods. Trump's tariff threatens to lower this figure and would most definitely hit French GDP. You would think that France would be closing ranks with their other trading partners, but we are seeing the exact opposite. Because of French support for the EV tariffs, Beijing is punishing French exports of cognac into China. And these tariffs can go as high as 39%, which could collapse sales into the country. Cognac is a luxury good, it's not an essential commodity. And because of this, France is pledging financial support to the cognac sector. So huge subsidies are coming, which balloons the French deficit even further. This is a big pity because China's trade with France is enormous. Bilateral trade was nearly $80 billion in 2023, but going forward, this number is probably going to fall. Fewer EVs will be exported into France. As a result, fewer French goods will flow into China as well. So you can literally see the economic trap France is in. The US is becoming protectionist, so this market will get harder for French companies to sell into. And unless they build factories within the US, exports are going to fall. Now, French exports to the EU have also peaked. Since 2022, France has been pushing more goods to the common market, but a downtrend has started, dropping from 28.5 billion euros down to 26 billion. And this shouldn't be a surprise here. Thanks to higher energy prices, the cost of living in Europe is astoundingly high. Considering most of French exports are discretionary, cutbacks are going to happen. You'll be buying more groceries and fuel rather than French perfume, and it's basic logic here. The problem now is more headwinds are coming from France. This trade war isn't the only crisis Macron has to face. France is opposing the upcoming EU-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement, and this is to allow the free flow of agricultural exports between the EU and South America. This is dangerous for France because it involves countries like Brazil and Argentina. These are big wheat and meat exporters whose cost of production is much lower than French markets. They aren't burdened with environmental regulations and the labor costs are leagues cheaper than French workers. So removing these tariffs will hurt farmers all across Europe. Now, this sector might only be 2% of French GDP, but it's still significant because of the outsized impacts. It could wipe the farmers out. Now, despite France looking to block the deal, guess what? Von der Leyen has officially sealed the agreement. There will be free trade between the EU and South America. And this goes beyond just food imports. The EU knows Latin America, especially Brazil, is a big market for car exports. Current tariffs into Latin America are over 30%. So taking this away will allow more EU car exports to enter the continent. At least that's the plan. But realize there are always sacrifices, and the price of German cars, for example, are already exceedingly high. The EU is just rearranging the deck chairs of the Titanic. To save their auto industry, they are willing to throw farmers under the bus. And even that is a big gamble because Chinese EVs are already extremely cheap. The fundamental problem of high production costs isn't solved yet, not by a long shot. And until the EU can find a cheaper source of energy, there's no escaping this economic disaster. No amount of financial engineering or trade deals can solve the problem. But let me know what you think. Will US sanctions work on Russian gas? And can France ever find a way out? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.